All right, I think we can safely start here, and I want to begin by welcoming everybody that's on this Zoom forum and thanking the Land Park Community Association for hosting it. This is a forum on Measure A, also known as Strong Mayor, of course. My name is Steve Large. I'm a reporter at Channel 13. Because we're doing the Zoom, I want to remind people for this particular format tonight, we believe that it may work best if you're on speaker view, but once you switch to speaker view and that's not to your liking, perhaps you might try something else. But we believe speaker view at this point might be the best. And we also recommend, if you are viewing this and not a participant, that you disable your video and mute yourself. So I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers. And we have two speakers, yes on A and no on A, Chet and Craig. I'll begin with Chet P. Hewitt here with Yes on Measure A. Chet is president and CEO of Sierra Health Foundation and his nonprofit intermediary partner, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation. Over the 13 years, Chet has led a bold collective impact strategy focused on promoting health and social justice in underserved communities. Prior to joining Sierra Health Foundation, Chet served as director of Alameda County Social Services Agency, associate director for the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, and director of the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice in San Francisco. Craig Powell is here with the No on Measure A group. After 3 decades in private law practice, Craig, a lifelong Land Park resident, jumped headfirst into community service. In 2009, he led the effort which reformed and democratized the LPCA. In 2010, he created the Land Park Volunteer Corps, which he heads today. And in 2011, Craig created and currently leads Eye on Sacramento, a local government watchdog organization which offers solutions to difficult municipal problems. And for those of you watching in Land Park, you'll be happy to know that both Craig and Chet are residents of Land Park. So I'm going to go over some of the rules, and then we'll get started with opening statements and questions. So each speaker will get 3 minutes to make an opening statement. We will then have a series of questions that will alternate between the presenters in terms of sequence. The questions were drawn up by the Land Park Community Association based on questions submitted by the public. And at the end of the forum, each presenter, Chet and Craig, will have one opportunity to directly ask his own question to the other. Now, both speakers will have 1.5 minutes to respond to the questions, and then 1 minute for a rebuttal if they choose. The League of Women Voters, and Patricia, you may see on the screen there, has volunteered to keep time for us, and we'll show a 30-second sign and then a stop sign that the speakers will be able to see. At the end of the forum, there will be an opportunity for 2-minute closing statements from each side. So right now, I want to begin just with a brief summary, and then we'll get to the questions. Bob, you can throw up the slide now. We do have a slide to show a brief summary of Measure A from the city attorney's analysis. I'll try to get through this quickly. If Measure A is approved, it would change the city charter. Under the current charter, the mayor is one of 9 council members. Under Measure A, the mayor is no longer a council member, but may attend council meetings. Under the current charter, the city manager is the city's CEO. Under Measure A, the mayor is the city's CEO. Under the current charter, the council appoints the city manager. Under Measure A, the mayor appoints the city manager with council concurrence. Under the current charter, 6 council members may remove the city manager. Under Measure A, the mayor may remove the city manager. Under the current charter, there is no mayoral veto. Under Measure A, the mayor can veto ordinances and the council approved budget. Under the current charter, there are no mayoral term limits. Under Measure A, the mayor has a 2-term limit. There are other provisions in the Measure A that you can see at the bottom of the screen there. I'm not going to recite all of them. We do hope that we'll get into them into great detail throughout the course of this forum. So with that, we will get started with our opening statements, and we'll begin here with Yes on Measure A. And Chet, take it away. Your opening statements, you've got 3 minutes.
As a supporter of the Mayor's Accountability and Community Equity Act, we think the measure is actually an upgrade to our current city system of government. The fact of the matter is the city of Sacramento is governed by a non-elected city manager whose work is not driven by the vision of leaders elected by city residents. The result is no clear lines of authority between our elected mayor, who people presume leads the city, and council members and those who are responsible for providing governmental services. Under the existing system, the primary goal of good government is to maintain current service models by ensuring their funding and stability. This results in a structure that severely limits the ability to make the policy and financial changes necessary to achieve a city that is affordable, equitable, inclusive, and just. We believe Measure A corrects this flaw by moving executive authority from a non-elected position to the elected official, the mayor, who is responsible for articulating a vision for the entire city and being accountable to all Sacramentans for its achievement. An example of this disconnect is what happened shortly after the murder of George Floyd, in which 2,000 residents showed up to do a die-in in front of the mayor's home, assuming that he had authority that he does not actually have. Finally, we believe that while the mayor gets new authority, there are sufficient and appropriate checks and balances on that particular authority. We're very supportive of the idea of a participatory budget, the expansion of a city council to 9 members, the social equity requirements so that all policy and budgetary decisions actually go through a review to determine the impact, an impact that is often doesn't consider the most marginal and most fragile among us. And for all of these reasons, we think you should vote yes on Measure A.
All right, Craig.
Thank you, Steve. I want to thank the Land Park Community Association. It's great to be back in Land Park. Been away for 2 years following a house fire, and our house was rebuilt, and we're very pleased to be back. Ion Sacramento has been involved in the Strong Mayor issue for about 6-7 years, actually about more like 9 years. We issued a very comprehensive report on Kevin Johnson's 2014 Strong Mayor proposal, Measure L, and we have issued a very comprehensive and thoughtful study of Measure A. And that report is available on Ion Sacramento's website at ionsacramento.org. I encourage you to read it. I encourage you to read the executive summary. It's detailed, it's authoritative, and it's I think, of real value. I think to be fully informed on this issue, at least read the executive committee, the executive summary. This issue was thoroughly debated in the last decade. It was reviewed by the courts, it was reviewed by the council, it was voted on by the people, and it was rejected at every turn. And that debate was comprehensive and extremely thorough. We had a 1-year charter review committee that had public hearings that considered the issue. It underwent incredible in-depth analysis by city staff. It was the subject of many, many public hearings. I want to contrast that with what we have with Measure A. Measure A was introduced on day 1. It was unveiled. We had never seen the text of it before. It came as a surprise. 12 days later, it was referred to the ballot. 0 analysis by staff, 0 fiscal evaluation, no review by the city's law and legislation committee, which is a violation of the council's own rules. It was done in the middle of a pandemic and an economic sharp recession. We've not had the opportunity to have the traditional inputs that we normally have in the process of making law. This is a complete overhaul of city governance. To do this in 12 days' time by bypassing all the normal procedures for assuring that there's adequate public input and review is really an affront to democracy. And we very much are opposed to that. We will get into the issues, but I want to do a quick highlight, and that is accountability. This does not promote accountability. Accountability means accountability for performance. And a city manager is hired by the city council and can be fired by the city council any given Tuesday night. An executive mayor or strong mayor, if he's a bad performer, cannot be fired by the city council. You have to wait perhaps 4 years to be able to give him a performance review or undergo the arduous procedure of recall. So there's really no accountability for performance under strong mayor. And while under the current system, there's performance reviews essentially every Tuesday night the council meets. Finally, this will dramatically diminish the influence of your city council members and derivatively our neighborhoods. What happens is there's a finite power in a closed government system. When you take off a huge slice and take it away from the council and give it to the mayor, you necessarily diminish the power of these council members. They will not have the power over the budget they once did. They will not have the power to fire the city manager, which is crucial. City bureaucracy pays attention.
Excuse me, Craig.
Yes.
I'm sorry, you are out of time, sir.
Okay, thank you. We'll get into the other details in response to another question.
Okay. Patricia is holding up the signs for all of us, and hopefully you guys can see them. We are going to get started with our questions now. And go ahead, Chet. Or pardon me, Greg.
Keep in mind, Steve, I cannot see those on my screen. So maybe if someone would just call out 10 seconds or something, that'll help.
We'll make that happen. Okay, Chet, yes on Measure A. The first question here. Measure A would require that at least $40 million be spent on inclusive and economic development and youth services. Why does Measure A have to pass for the city to do this? What types of programs would be included under the umbrella of inclusive and economic development and youth services?
Well, I think the rationale behind the carve out in the budget is because the city, under this current form of government, has been unable to come to some agreement to make those type of investments actually happen. This is inclusive economic development. This is an opportunity to ensure that communities that often get left behind and get left out become a focus of our investments, particularly around business development, small business development, and investment in young people and youth. We know that we actually had measures and opportunities in the past to try to bring forward these types of opportunities to ensure that a city is actually investing in its most valuable resource, its young people. It has not happened. We think when you have a mayor who articulates the importance of these things and the power to actually make them happen, the challenge of moving an agenda forward that really is inclusive, that really allows Sacramento to be the best city it could possibly be, is just much more likely to happen. In this case, we are putting it in a charter so that it's not dependent upon a single mayor or the whims of a council that often struggles to find agreement. But it'll be a mandated carve out for young people and for economic development as a way of funding the notion of equity, not simply talking about it.
Greg, would you like me to repeat the question or you want to just go for it?
If you could repeat it, please.
Measure A would require that at least $40 million be spent on inclusive and economic development and youth services. Why does Measure A have to pass for the city to do this? What types of programs would be included under the umbrella of inclusive and economic development and youth services?
Clearly, the measure does not need to pass for the city council to spend it on such programs at all. And we don't have any idea what the terms inclusive economic growth means. It's not defined anywhere in the provision or under law or in the charter amendment. This is one of the most dangerous provisions in this measure because it's a huge exercise in ballot box budgeting. That is precisely why the mayor opposed Measure G in the March primary, because it was ballot box budgeting. It strips the council of the discretion to be able to determine spending priorities in response to changing conditions, particularly during economic downturns. And the voters had the good sense to reject that then. That was just a $10 million annual diversion. This one is a $40 million diversion. Now, we have about a $500 million a year general fund. This is a huge chunk of that. And for those who don't know it, about 80% of the general fund is spent on public safety. That's police, fire, and ambulance services. So when you take a whack of $40 million out of the general fund and commit it legally and embargo it for one category of spending, and you don't bring any other resources to the table, you have to force cuts in other parts of the budget. And because about 80% of the general fund is spent on public safety, this is going to force cuts in public safety. Fewer police officers, fewer firefighters, fewer ambulances. There's been no analysis of the impact of this, but that's the mathematical reality of the consequence of this provision being in there.
And your time's up. Thanks for that. Chet, you have an opportunity for rebuttal if you choose.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that several years ago, we actually passed Measure U, which was a set aside for a 1 cent increase in tax, with half of that money actually going to inclusive economic development. And from my esteemed colleague, inclusive economic development is defined. It is a term that actually means including folks who are usually left out of economic development opportunities, and making sure they are part of those economic development opportunities. So it funds things like employment and training for young people, education assistance for young people. It supports small businesses. Those are the things that actually make a city thrive. 40% of the businesses in Sacramento are actually small business. We think those things are very, very important. That half cent of Measure U, upon the first budget presented by the city manager, was completely consumed by the bureaucracy in the city. So although the citizens had decided to tax themselves, because Measure U did in fact pass, for these very types of activities, the budget that was presented did not allow for any of that to be funded initially.
Craig, you want to say anything?
Yeah, when Measure U, the second Measure U was passed, it did not set aside 50% for inclusive economic growth. The mayor, during the campaign, and I headed up the campaign to oppose it, we counted him making 15 different promises on how that money would be spent. It was a general fund, general tax increase, not a special tax. Consequently, it could not be committed legally to spending in any particular fashion. Had it had such a commitment, it would have required a 2/3 majority vote, which that measure did not obtain. So, and we argued during that campaign, hey, we're facing major budget deficits, and these funds are likely to end up going to closing these budget deficits. And that's precisely what happened. And it's not because the city manager acted improperly. Believe me, if the city manager acted improperly, city council could fire him on any given Tuesday night. He acted with the agreement of a majority of the council, something that the mayor apparently takes objection to.
All right, we're going to move on to this next question here. And this one will start with the no on Measure A, Craig's side. If Measure A passes, Craig, should we expect Sacramento to be more like cities with a strong mayor form of government like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Oakland? Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
It is clearly a bad thing. There are only 5 cities in California among its 450 cities that have a strong mayor. And academic studies have shown very clearly that convictions for corruption in municipal government is 50% greater in cities with strong mayor forms of government than they are in cities with a city manager form of government. And there's a very obvious reason for that, because a strong mayor has greater power, and money goes and temptations are triggered when people have a concentration of power. It becomes one-man government, and that one man tends to be more frequently involved in acts of corruption. Do we want to go there? No. How have they been performing? How has the city of San Francisco and Oakland and LA been performing? Actually, it's been pretty abysmal. Having professional management to do the administrative work of a city is simply smart. And that's what the progressive movement promoted in the early part of the 20th century. It's why Sacramento has stuck by it for about a century. It separates the politics from the sound management. You need both. The council is the articulation of the political wishes of the people, and that is balanced against with professional management that can make things happen that the politicians and the people want. It is the best of all possible worlds to marry those two in a city council manager form of government.
All right, Chet, would you like me to repeat the question, or do you want to just go for it?
Could you repeat the question, please?
If Measure A passes, should we expect Sacramento to be more like cities with a strong mayor form of government like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Oakland? Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
We think a strong mayor form of government is a very good thing. And while you could simply look at the cities in California, like Oakland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, you can also look at some cities around the country, like Columbus, Ohio, or Honolulu. In fact, of the 40 largest cities in America, 22 of them actually have a strong mayor form of government. And while many, or I would actually argue all large cities are facing challenges around economies, around homelessness, and others, many of these cities are actually some of the leading innovators in responding to some of the challenges that large cities are actually experiencing as well. And while there's lots of data out there around strong mayor versus council systems, I can tell you that there's also a lot of evidence, one from the University of Pennsylvania, that actually shows there is no greater sign of corruption for cities led by a strong mayor. So while the data out there, I think, is broad and diverse and inconclusive, we know that there are lots of opportunities and lots of examples where strong mayors, where cities with strong mayors have done wonderful jobs attending to some of the more vexing problems that large cities face. And we believe that Sacramento can be in a position to be an innovator in that regard as well.
You want to address any of that?
Yeah, if you want a citation to the academic study, I'd be happy to provide it. It was out of the University of North Carolina, came out just last year. And you know, we can look at anecdotes and we could argue that these major cities in California are not doing a very good job, particularly on the crisis issues of like homelessness. And I don't see any one of those cities essentially being all that stellar in dealing with the problems. As a matter of fact, it's quite the reverse. They've had, the problems are chronically worsening. And that is a recurring thing with strong mayors. When you have professional management by city managers who have risen through the ranks over a course of decades of increasing authority and responsibility, you get better management.
Chet?
Yeah, I think if all you think about in terms of management is efficiency, one can make an argument for that. One of the reports cited in Ion Sacramento's study actually talks about a study done by IBM, which actually shows that city manager governments can be up to 10% more efficient. But in the 21st century, not the 20th, efficiency is not the gold standard for a well-run city. Equity, inclusiveness, fairness, growth, and innovation are essential for cities to continue to thrive. So the reports that actually are being referenced here are not really aligned with the challenges that large cities are actually facing. Furthermore, Columbus, Ohio, which is considered one of the leaders in dealing with homelessness, is a strong mayor city. And so you can't just look at cities in California if you want to make that assessment. In the same way that some of the academic journals that he's actually referring looked at cities across the country, and they are very different in terms of their context and demographics and so forth, it's hard to simply take that particular data and apply it to Sacramento, one of the most diverse cities in America.
We're going to move on to the next question now, and we'll begin with the yes on Measure A side. Chet, this one's for you first. A mayor can only be removed from office every 4 years, while the city council can vote at any time to remove a city manager who is not doing their job. With that in mind, does Measure A provide more or less accountability, and why?
Well, I think it provides more accountability because the accountability is not just around the removal of a mayor. How about the performance of a mayor? How about the ability to give the mayor the tools that they actually need to put the vision that they articulate, which leads to their success in our electoral process, to the test? And that test is for it to be implemented. That is the gold standard of an elected official. We don't believe that the power actually makes it more difficult. In the history of the city, there has not been a city manager fired in over a decade. While some managers have actually left under pressure, city managers have not been fired. And the only way to remove, and the way to remove a mayor is not simply every 4 years by way of election. While it is challenging and is difficult in democracy, it works in that way in democracy, you can also recall a mayor for a lack of performance as well.
Well, if I may, we have showed the door to 2 city managers in the last decade. Chet, you may not be aware of that, but that has happened. They've had a parting of the ways. It was papered over a little bit, but everyone understood that they were to let go because of inadequate or unacceptable performance. You can't do that with a strong mayor. When you have a strong mayor that is failing and flailing and not delivering the goods, you can't do anything about it except what you refer to as a recall. Well, let me tell you something. A recall is the most turbulent, disturbing, monumental task imaginable in a city. It tends to tear a city apart. It costs mountains of money. It takes a long, long time. If you think that's the best way to ensure performance is to have the check of recall, as the best way of controlling your executive management, I have to just completely disagree with you. A city manager, on the other hand, these are professionals. They sometimes know they get moved out and move on. And that is a way to make sure we have peak performance out of the chief executive of the officer of the city. And by the way, if he doesn't reflect the vision of the city council that hires him or her, the city council, as I had mentioned, any Tuesday night can move him or her on. So that is the ultimate check. That's the ultimate assurance and guarantee of performance, is to be able to remove them if they're failing.
Chet?
No, I try to be precise in my language. So papering over and moving folks on because the performance has not been well is not firing someone. So I stand by my statement that there have not been any firings of any city managers in that time. I also did not say that it was an easy process to remove a mayor. The question was, are there opportunities and ways to actually do that? I think there are. We all know that it's not very often that mayors find themselves in a position where that level of performance requires or is encouraged by folks because it is messy, it is time consuming, and it is expensive. It's also very embarrassing for elected officials, which incentivizes their willingness to do well. And in this town, we've had the good fortune, and residents have been smart enough to elect people who have the quality, the values to actually try to govern as best as possible. I'll actually trust the voters in their selection of who should lead this city.
Well, if I may, and I don't think it's a matter of good intention, Chet. I think they all intend to do well. The question is, do they come to the job of chief executive with the skills to do it, in the experience? And let's take a look at Darrell Steinberg. While he did head up the state Senate, and there were some major issues during that tenure, he has no experience in leading a $1.3 billion a year business with 4,500 employees. A city manager, on the other hand, as I mentioned, who goes through the ranks in earlier smaller positions, moves up in terms of authority, experience, and talent, is battle tested. They are ready and able to be a competent and effective administrator. And that's precisely what you want. You do not want to put someone in who is a skilled politician, but needs training wheels in order to be an executive. That's not the skill set we want in a chief executive. We want someone who's a leader of the council and a leader of the city on policy. And that's the critical formative role that a mayor plays. And this mayor has been very effective at that role in terms of getting that council to be behind him. I don't think he's ever been on the losing end of a split vote at the city council.
Greg, I'm going to stop you right there. You're out of time, but we are going to move on to the next question. And this one will go to no on Measure A first. We'll go for you to you first, Craig.
Sure.
In what ways will Measure A affect the ability of the mayor to act quickly and decisively in confronting the city's urgent challenges?
Well, I know this is a point that's being made by the Yes campaign, but I don't see whether there's really any difference in an executive mayor, a strong mayor, or a city manager situation in terms of speed of response. I would think that if you have an experienced professional city manager, he will have the management team arrayed to be able to respond quickly and intelligently in cases of emergencies. I don't think a politician city manager or politician executive mayor is necessarily going to have the chops to be able to act quickly and responsibly and intelligently. In any event, the mayor would be working through staff on such things. I don't know if it would be an appreciable difference. If there is any difference, I think it would be negligible, in my opinion.
Joe, would you like me to repeat that question, or you want to just go for it?
No, I have the question. Thank you. I think that it would really give the opportunity for much more prompt responses, because the mayor would also be the chief executive. And those of us who understand how business is structured, the chief executive actually has certain powers and resources at his disposal that the mayor has got to, under the current form of government, garner a lot of support for. The mayor, as my colleague Craig says, would also have a city manager to help him figure out how to do that. So it isn't simply all on the mayor and the mayor's experience to know that. It's really about the mayor's ability to offer direction for certain things to be done and to expedite those things in terms of carrying them out. So I think that you would see much more responsive and nimble activity on the part of the mayor in response to any crisis we might be facing.
If I may, Chet referred previously to the IBM study, which showed that on average, city manager forms of government are somewhat more efficient than a strong mayor form of government. What they also showed was that there was very little difference in policy. And I think that's important to note, that both forms of government are pretty responsive to the will of the public. So for those who think that strong mayor is going to suddenly lead to a sharp change or change of course in policy, that's highly unlikely. I think that the thing that's most concerning to me on this is that we're a city of neighborhoods traditionally. And the support for our neighborhoods and responsiveness to neighborhood concerns is traditionally and a very important thing to Sacramento. And our neighborhoods are very, very diverse. And one thing about having a city council is that you will have a variety of opinions representing diverse neighborhoods. So everybody generally ends up with a seat at the table. At least that's the ideal, and it generally works out pretty close to that in practice. When you centralize power in one man or
Hey,
woman,
Craig.
you lose that benefit.
Craig,
Chet,
sorry.
do you want to take an
Time's up.
opportunity to follow up on that, or do you want to move on?
I'll move on.
I'm sorry, to Chet. Do you have an opportunity to follow up on that with any final thoughts, Chet?
Yeah, the IBM study is a very interesting one because it was written by the Global Business Services and actually supported, although it's hard to find who originally funded it, by the International City Managers Association. So in your report, you talk often about conflicts. There's a potential for a pretty serious conflict here. So I think you have to take that report with a grain of salt. I also say you don't lose anything in terms of the neighborhoods or represented by council members and their ability to actually have their voices heard, at the city council as well. In fact, we'd be expanding the number of city council members to 9 through Measure A. The city council will actually get a president and a vice president who will run that legislative process. It will actually be a better, more efficient, and more effective form of government should Measure A pass.
Chet, I just don't think that's true. One of the biggest problems under this is the mayor would go off the city council, which means citizens could not go down to city council and look at and talk directly to the mayor.
You know what, Craig? I'm going to ask that question next. So let's start right here with that question in mind. And this one's going to go first to yes on Measure A. This is to you, Chet. At the moment, the mayor must attend city council meetings. If strong mayor passes, he won't have to. How would this change affect the mayor's responsiveness to the needs of the people he represents?
While the mayor will not be obligated to attend, the mayor can attend city council meetings, and I would expect, given our mayor, that he would attend city council meetings as well. There has been no indication that the mayor would feel to be responsive or that folks who care to petition the mayor could feel to find him. The mayor will still work at City Hall. The mayor lives in this city, and you can ask the 2,000 folks who actually showed up for the die-in, who petitioned the mayor in a more direct form, his front yard, that if he was absent, folks would be able to find him as well. It's an interesting dilemma to try to figure out how to respond to some of these particular issues, should they actually show up. But our expectation is that the mayor will be as available to be petitioned by citizens who have concerns as he has been in the past.
Well, Chet, I just don't think that's true. I've lived through a few mayors, and I hearken back to the previous mayor, Kevin Johnson. And I'll tell you something, I can't tell you the number of times where individual citizens would go to the dais and they would plead their case that they had been ignored, or their concerns had been ignored. And Kevin Johnson took it upon himself to get involved in helping those average, everyday citizens time after time after time after time. That is a terribly important interface between the citizen and their government. And that's going to be gone. The only people who are going to be able to get in to see the mayor primarily are going to be special interests, the well-heeled, and the politically well-connected, because the mayor is not going to be able to meet with others as frequently. But I'll tell you something, when they are humanized by seeing constituents week after week, they have their finger on the pulse of the citizenry so much better than if they're sitting in their chambers in City Hall having one-on-one meetings with influential special interests. This may sound like a small issue.
Let me get Chet an opportunity to respond, and then you'll get a response as well. Chet?
You know, I think there's a lot of presumption built in that response into what the behavior of a human being will actually be, particularly an elected official. And knowing some of the elected officials that you have referenced, both former Mayor Kevin Johnson and the current Mayor Darrell Steinberg, my sense is they're not going to be sitting holed up in a room pandering to special interests and not taking care of the concerns of average citizens. What I will say, though, is that you cannot petition a city manager. So the fact that that's not available to any of us currently, the man who controls the budget, the man who controls how city departments operate, one can say that this is in no way going to actually further distance the mayor from the concerns that residents of this city actually have and his duty to respond to them.
Great.
Well, right now we have 8 city council members who are the boss of the city manager. They can and do fire city managers. So when a citizen goes to their council member and says, I have a problem, then that city council member or their staff calls the city manager or the city bureaucracy. And the bureaucrats or the manager themselves respond with alacrity as a general rule to those concerns, because they know if they ignore the phone calls from the city council members, they're at risk of being fired. And one greatest way to destroy your career as an up-and-coming city bureaucrat is to ignore the wishes of a city council member. So having an empowered, fully engaged, influential city council member is essential for neighborhoods to have an impact at City Hall, for individuals to have impact at City Hall. And when you slice away so much of their power and hand it over to a single person, a mayor, their power abates. The city bureaucracy no longer, or city manager, no longer would live in fear of being fired by the city council, because the city council would lose that ability to remove them. That has a huge impact. That'll change the culture dramatically at City Hall. The only one they're going to want to please is going to be the mayor.
All right, Craig, we're going to move on here to this next one. And, here we are doing a forum on Zoom, and that is because we are in the year 2020. It's been a year like no other, of course. We're going to begin here with the no on Measure A side. Craig, why is now the time to have this measure on the ballot?
Well, I started earlier to contrast the way Kevin Johnson's efforts at advancing strong mayor were handled compared to what how they handled this one. It's called, participatory democracy. It's called a proper process. These are democratic norms and values that we have a long tradition of honoring in Sacramento. It is important to us for us to be able to feel like this is our city. It is not our city when we are excluded from the assessment, drafting, evaluation, negotiation, and modification of the major change in the form of government that we've seen in a century. That is not the Sacramento way. And this was intentionally timed to be submitted at the very last possible moment for it to be placed on the ballot, to deprive the public and the potential critics and opponents of the opportunity to organize and critique this and evaluate it and to write op-eds about it and to organize about it. This is a very
Greg,
cynical,
20 seconds.
Yes, this was a very cynical effort. And it's not, and that is why I think so many Sacramentans are upset at this. If they had done it the way it was done before, you would have a charter review committee. I remember former Mayor Ann Rudin attended every single one of the public hearings held by that charter review committee. And I think there must have been 20 of them around the city.
Okay.
She
Time's
was a
up.
diligent citizen. That's the way Sacramento is. That's the way we should be doing things,
Greg,
not trashing our democracy.
time is up.
Ed, would you like me to ask the question, or you got it? Chet?
I think I have the question. I think, as Craig has pointed out, this issue has been studied on multiple occasions. And while the hearing was swift and the movement happened quickly, we think, given the times that we're living in, that quick and swift movement on the part of government is actually and not something that is detrimental. There was a hearing at the City Council where amendments were actually made to the measure. 6 of the 9 members of the council supported it. It's, they would not be supporting a measure that they did not believe was good for the city. Those are the very representatives of the neighborhoods that Craig was alluding to, who he said, look out for the health and safety, vitality of those neighborhoods. 6 decided that this was something that should go forward. We believe that the time in which it's happening is evidence of the need to be able to move, quickly. And quickly doesn't mean that it's not thoroughly vetted, doesn't mean that it's thoughtful. It means that it's responsive to the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
10 seconds, Chad.
Social health circumstances that we're experiencing are just demonstrative of the need to have a city government that can actually move thoughtfully and quickly.
Craig, you want to respond?
Well, let's take a look at that vote by the City Council. It was a 6-3 split vote. Several of those members of the council are running now for higher office. Ashby and Guerra have both expressed the fact that they're going to run for state senate. So who do they look for support? They're going to look to Darrell Steinberg, who's the most powerful politician in town. So is it any surprise that they're going to vote in favor of placing on the ballot his favorite little major piece of reform or change, and that is strong mayor? No. Steve Hansen, while he's no longer a politician, is probably looking for a new position. Having a good to steady friend in Darrell Steinberg will help him in his career ambitions. Now let's look at the ones who voted against. Jeff Harris is at the end of his business career. He is not looking to advance politically.
And 10 seconds, Craig.
And as well as Larry Carr, he's cycling off the council. He doesn't have to is not beholden to political interests. They voted their conscience and they voted no. Alan Warren's running for re-election. He's made a calculation that his electorate is opposed to this. That's
Craig,
why he's
sir, the time is up.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, would you like to have a final thought on this?
Well, I'll say 6-3 is a supermajority of the council. And I won't engage in a kind of cynical commentary about what drives people's decision making. I think in this city we have some great politicians. I think they were all thoughtful and fair in determining whether they would support this particular measure. And I think their position stands on its face.
All right, let's go to this next question here. And Chet, we're going to start with you. Yes on Measure A begins with this round of questions. Financially, what will cost more taxpayer dollars, the current form of government or the proposed form under Measure A? And how should that be factored in to voters' decisions?
I can't cite any specific studies that talk about what the relative cost is. I think that that's likely to be negligible. From some of the reports that we've actually seen, they said there will be no financial impact. It is really a structural realignment of roles and responsibilities within city government. My sense was that there's potential for some savings. As you know, there was an efficiency study conducted by the city. This is something my colleague often references in many of the reports that they actually write. Wouldn't it be great if we had a mayor who could actually effectuate some of the efficiency measures that were pointed out in that report as part of the new authority the mayor would actually have? So while there is no specific study saying that there'd be a financial impact, no great savings, no great expense, there is an opportunity through real leadership to become more efficient.
Craig?
Well, Chet, nothing's been stopping the mayor from enacting any of those or all those reforms in what you refer to as the management partners efficiency study. They've identified over 30 ways the city could save tens of millions of dollars. We issued our own study 2 years ago and found 125 million they could cut. The problem has been a political will. You have to have the political will to rein in excessive spending, and we haven't seen that on this city council. It's not a matter of form of government. It's a matter of the will of our elected officials. Now, as far as the relative cost of one form of government or another, there are going to be some higher costs under a strong mayor. It calls for the creation or recreation of a housing commission, which was abandoned by the city several years ago because it served no real function. It also calls for the creation of a social equity commission or standing committee. It doesn't make clear which one. However, the biggest budget buster is the $40 million annual spending mandate. That is the ticking time bomb on a city that already is facing growing projected deficits. That will slash and burn through our city services. There's no other way to do it, or it will create massive pressures for new tax hikes on top of the Measure U tax hike the voters approved 2 years ago.
15 seconds.
There's no other way about it. It's pure mathematics. And you know, our council is supposed to have the discretion to deal with change and changing financial conditions and doing it in a smart and adroit way. When you handcuff them with these mandates, they can't do their job for us.
All right, thank you, Craig. Chet, would you like one more opportunity to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that the baseline for investment in communities, disadvantaged communities, is not an addition to the budget. I want to be clear about that. The addition of additional committees has no viable or significant fiscal impact on the operation of the city. And while there's an argument could be made that the mayor could have enacted some of the efficiency study provisions, the mayor does not have the authority because that is left to the city manager.
No,
Craig?
that's just not true, Chet. The city council has the authority to authorize the approval of programs or cutting spending. They control the budget. They ultimately can tell the manager to do whatever the heck they want to tell him. And if he refuses to do it, he's shown the door. So it is not the city manager is the final arbiter on how the city spends money. It's just not the case.
I'll give you an opportunity to respond if you choose to, Chet.
Yeah, the city manager actually presents the budget. Your argument earlier on was that the city manager has a professional responsibility and expertise to actually make those happen. My argument is simple. The mayor does not have the authority by himself to make that happen. That is accurate. And the city manager has not found the will, along with the city council, to put any of those things in place. So your argument is accurate, and we believe that the form of government that we're proposing will actually change that and make it more likely that someone will be responsible and accountable for putting those provisions in place.
All right. Craig, I have lost your picture, but can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay, and I see you again here. I'm going to ask this one last question, and then we'll give you both an opportunity to ask each other directly a question of your choice. Last question here is getting back to a point that's already been touched on, but perhaps we can emphasize or flesh out a little bit more on this subject. And we'll begin with the no on Measure A side. Craig, this will go to you first. Does Measure A give average citizens and neighborhoods a stronger voice in government or a weaker voice? What about special interests, donors, and organizations vying for city dollars?
It'll do two things. It'll weaken the voice of neighborhoods. And the reason for that is neighborhoods' influence are derivative from the power and influence of a council member. And this measure will slice off a huge chunk of the power of council and the individual members of that council. And as a consequence, that derivative power of the neighborhood to influence the council member and change city behavior is diminished. That's just political reality. And that's true in every city that has adopted strong mayor. The second part of your question, I forget. What was that, Jeff?
What about special interest donors and organizations vying for city dollars?
Well, you'll notice by looking at the contribution reports for the Yes on Measure A campaign that special interests are in love with this. They gave generously to Kevin Johnson's Measure L campaign. They like dealing with one person. They like only having to write one campaign check instead of writing it to 8 different members of the city council. That's a little cynical, but that's also political reality. They like sitting in the closed room with a powerful mayor rather than having to touch base with 8 council members. So you will see an acceleration or an increase, and a rather significant one, on the powers of special interest. And all those discussions, by the way, are going to be happening behind closed doors. The mayor is not subject to the Brown Act. The city council is. So I think this is going to cheat Sacramento out of its treasured democratic values. I think it increases the risk of corruption. The studies show that it does, and it'll diminish the quality of the decision making.
Excuse me, Craig.
Yes.
We're out of time.
Okay.
Check. Would you like me to repeat that question for you, or do you have it?
Please, could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
That was a long
So
answer.
this is an opportunity for the yes on Measure A to respond to this question. Measure A, does Measure A give average citizens and neighborhoods a stronger voice in government or a weaker voice? What about special interests, donors, and organizations vying for city dollars?
I think it actually strengthens the voice in a number of ways. First, at the community level, council members will have discretion over land use decisions in ways they did not have before. And we know that is a really big and important issue as well. At the city level, because of the institutionalization of participatory budgeting, where communities will have a voice in the development of the budget process, and because of social equity assessments, where there'll be studies that will be necessary to determine what the impact of a policy, financial or operational change will have on those communities. Those particular hearings will give new forums for folks to provide upfront input on those particular issues as well. I would also argue, as someone who worked in the public sector for a good part of my career, that isn't just about being in a room with one strong person, that corruptive power is most effective along diffusion. And because we don't have any centralized way of managing it, a balanced government with both the legislature and an executive officer, it's probably easier for special interests to get their way under the current form of government than it would be otherwise. That may not be the case because we have good public officials in Sacramento, not because special interests somehow have lost the ability to leverage influence. That is simply not the case.
I'm going to stop you right there. I'll give you the opportunity to respond, but Craig, you get an opportunity first.
Yeah, Chet, you misstated when you say that this is going to give the city council more power over land use. The city council already has plenary power over land use decisions. This does not give them any additional powers at all. So I'm not feeling this idea at all that that we're going to make it a more participatory environment when you concentrate power in one person. I don't buy that, and I don't think that's worked in cities that have strong mayor, and I don't think that would work here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not a concentration of power in a single individual. It is a distribution of power, both on the legislative side and the executive side, that actually gets to both a more efficient, but also a more equitable and inclusive, form of government for the city of Sacramento. And the issues around land use decisions and how that will actually make the city council is actually reading into the charter amendment directly.
One last point I want to make on participatory budgeting. You said that this would enact participatory budgeting. In fact, the language of the proposed charter amendment merely requires that a city budget include at least one item from a single line item in a budget prepared with citizen input, and I call that the 1 penny rule. That as long as a city budget includes 1 penny of spending as recommended by a budget produced in a citizen's process, it has complied with these bare bone requirements for participatory budgeting. That means that they're not being serious when they promote this measure of really including meaningful participatory budgeting. Because if they had, they would have enacted real assurance that the participatory budgeting would have a real slice of the city budget to carve up.
Okay.
Well, I actually believe that's actually a very good thing that it's not spelled out. Otherwise, it would no longer be participatory. It would be in simply following existing mandates. And that's not what we're actually talking about. So the opportunity for it not to be spelled out is because that is the doorway for folks to actually participate and have their voices heard. So there isn't any definitive set-asides or any definitive programs, because the process is designed to allow people to articulate those desires and aspirations themselves.
We're going to move
That's
on
what
to
this-
this last round. And
That's
I'm sorry. I jumped on you then. I apologize for that, Chet. I didn't mean to do that. I thought you were finished. Did you want to finish up?
No, my last sentence was, that's what this participatory budgeting looks like. That's what democracy looks like. Not for everything to be so finely tuned that there is no space for the ideas and aspirations of citizens to be included in that process.
All right. I apologize for that. This
No
last
problem.
round here, 2 questions. Chet, you get the opportunity to ask the no on Measure A side, your own question, and then we'll follow that up. Craig, you'll get the opportunity to ask the yes on Measure A side, your own question. So Chet, go ahead and ask Craig whatever you'd like.
Well, you know, Measure A is entitled the Mayor's Accountability and Community Equity Act. You know, equity is a big issue in the cities. And this is not an argument against efficiency or some of the other tools that cities have got to comply with to be great places to live as well. In a recent Brookings study, Sacramento ranked 46th of the 53 metropolitan areas of 1 million people or more on equity, affordability around housing, issues around disinvestment in older urban corridor communities, homelessness, some of the more challenging and vexing problems that many cities are experiencing across this country. Aside from your quest for efficiency, in the sense that having an elected leader responsible and accountable for making those things happen, progress against some of those challenges happens. I'd like to hear from you what you think you would do aside from efficiency to actually deal with the level of inequality that the Mayor's Accountability and Community Equity Act actually puts in place, as it empowers citizens to be part of the think tank that actually is going to address some of the issues that we are experiencing here in Sacramento.
You know, I encourage people to read our study. And this is a real problem because this thing has a lot of vague promises. None of it is specific. None of it is quantifiable. All of it is feel good, sound good salesmanship with no substance. And you know, minority communities in this town, particularly the African-American community, who the NAACP has come out against this. A lot of other African-American leaders have come out against this. They have been burned time and time again by phony promises by politicians. And this is setting them up for failure once again if they buy into this. And that is why I'm convinced that in a poll, 70% of the respondents in the NAACP poll said that they were against this. They were tired of being misled. And I fear that given the imprecise and I think almost insincere efforts at, quote, equity in this measure is going to, again, make minority voters cynical towards the city. I think that is a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. We need to be serious about what really promotes solutions. And the biggest problem we have in Sacramento, really, if we want to talk about low economic growth or failure to thrive, is our educational system. Our school system is an absolute paralysis. And nobody of stature in this city is doing anything about it. We have a union at the throats of the administration of Sac City Unified and vice versa, while the whole house is burning down. Where's the political leadership to take that problem and to solve that problem?
Your time's up.
That's, I think that's my best answer that I can give you, Chet.
Chet, you want to respond? You got a minute for a response if you'd like.
Well, as a straw posed by NAACP includes anybody. You don't have to be African American to actually participate in that particular straw poll. So its ability to simply articulate, you know, where African Americans are, I think are limited. It's a good thing to do. It's an inclusive thing to do, but it isn't determinative of simply African American opinion. As someone who works closely in the African American community and has run a number of programs that have been very successful in the African American community, along with a number of my colleagues, including Cassandra Jennings and others who are supportive of what's actually happening, we believe that building equity into the structure is one of the most important and powerful ways to deal with structural racism and exclusion. It is a structural shift, not one built on personality. So including these elements, the spending, the social equity assessments, the notion that you will have a set aside in the budget means that how it's done will shift over time with different individuals. But the fact that it will be done is an essential and critical part of what change looks like. Great cities make commitments to their children and their marginalized populations and follow through with the promises that are made by elected officials and have the structure to make that happen.
Craig, you want to move on to the next question? Do you want an opportunity to respond?
No, I'd be happy to move on.
Okay, so this is your opportunity, the no on Measure A side, to ask your own question directly to the yes on Measure A side, Chet. So here's your opportunity, Craig, go for it.
You know, one thing voters have a challenge in doing is deciding who to trust. And the mayor has lined up a series of surrogates, Mr. Hewitt included, who are out speaking in favor of this. These are also some of the people who are signers of his ballot arguments in favor of Measure A. As a matter of fact, we took a look at those ballot arguments authors, and we saw that a majority of them have potential financial conflicts of interest in supporting this measure, in that a majority of them are either employed by or married to or in the process of seeking funding for organizations that they're employed by. And that's true in the case of Mr. Hewitt as well. Mr. Hewitt, who has a very compelling personal story, is the CEO of the Sierra Health Foundation. He also serves as the co-founder of Build Black. And he sent a letter to the city council along with other members of Build Black on August 2, just a couple days before the council approved putting it on the ballot. And he said, we also feel strongly that the charter amendment as it now stands manifests the racist ideologies that it aims to change. We urge you to assemble a diverse community to incorporate our collective votes into the revised charter. That would help combat the structural racism that stains the proposed charter amendment. Now, 2 days later, the council approved this. A few days after that, Mr. Hewitt came out in favor of this measure, this amendment, quoted in the Sacramento Observer as supporting it, signed the ballot argument in favor of it. And then within 22 days after he sent this letter, his organization, the Sierra Health Foundation, had received not one, but 2 grants from the city of Sacramento. One for $1.25 million and another one for about $1.3 million. His organization has received over $2.5 million.
We got to get to the question, Craig. We got to get to the question.
And the question really is Chet, are you in favor of Measure A because you think as a citizen you think it's in the best interest of the city, or are you in favor of it because you think it's in the best interest of your employer, the Sierra Health Foundation, who receives these grants?
I think one of the most compelling identifiers of a weak argument is the need to devolve into personal attacks. Let me just say that. All that you actually said is true. But the Sierra Health Foundation in our year history, we have given away over community efforts to improve access to healthcare, to support economic development, and to do many of the things we know cities do for young people, for seniors, for those who don't have health care. The grants that you speak of, one, the $1.25 million grant, was a partnership we started with the city, which was actually designed to actually create opportunities for young people that we call pop-ups. It was a direct response to some of the challenges that were happening at the mall during Christmas because all park and rec facilities were closed, as were all boys and girls clubs. We invested over $250,000 in launching 13 pop-up sites, which got kids from the mall to youth development activities. That money was to support that activity. So the city joined us. And yes, they did put money up. That's what great cities do. The second grant is for Healing the Hood. We also run a project that actually resulted for no underage, contributed along with others, for no underage deaths for kids under the age of 18 for over 26 months in this city. And when we seen a spike in gunfire and gun-related violence, we went to the city using some of our own resources as a co-investor again, and so that we need given of the pandemic, because that's when we saw the spike take off, and we know that it was having huge implications around the health and mental health of children. So your cynical insinuations that somehow we must all be bad people seeking to simply line our pockets is not in line with my history or how I run the Sierra Health Foundation, which has done some pretty phenomenal work here in Sacramento and is known for that work, not only in the state of California, but nationally.
We went a little over time because I thought it was important for you to be able to make your point, given the substance of the question. Craig, do you want to respond to that?
No, and I don't mean to single you out, Chet, other than the fact that you're the man who's sitting across from me. This is true of Cassandra Jennings, who's married to Rick Jennings. Her organization has received 2 grants in the last month, totaling over $2 million. You know, when the mayor trots people out like this, and when they say this is a great deal for the city, I mean, you have to be sensible and ask this question, do they really mean it? Or do they see this as a pipeline for additional funding for their organizations? This is not a matter of personal corruption, but this is a matter of patronage that is increasingly, I think, growing in Sacramento. We see an increasing amount of the city budget now going towards grants to nonprofit organizations who are increasingly politically very influential. And we don't see that necessarily as a healthy trend. And maybe it's okay if there's full and fair disclosure of who is asking for what and what their organizations are getting in return.
Well, that's all vetted to City Council. All of those, the proposals and the co-investments that you referenced, all passed unanimously, even by some folks who are opposing the strong mayor. We are not concerned about being vetted. We stand on our accomplishments. We have an incredible team here at the foundation. Groups like the Urban League, who have long histories of doing employment and training and moving people to self-sufficiency, are groups that should be supported by our public sector because of their success. And we should be careful, particularly if you're going to impinge leaders of color, because it is in fact part of the challenge that we are experiencing here in Sacramento, is that the presumption is that there must be something amiss because we're seeking resources to do good work.
Well, nothing could be further from the truth in terms of my critique of this potential conflict of interest. I think that people ought to know about these things. Then they can evaluate it in light of this information, Chad.
The only examples you used were folks of color. You know, I noticed in your report about conflicts, because I tend to read everything, that you did not say much about support in your opposition that comes from labor, who has a direct benefit, perhaps, or could derive a benefit from money not being carved out of the budget as we seek to address issues like pension liabilities and others in the future as well. My recollection is your analysis on that conflict was one sentence.
Well, that's because when we analyzed the ballot, the writers of the ballot arguments opposed to Measure A, there was only one signer who had a potential financial conflict of interest, and we identified him, and that was the president of the firefighters union. So we identified.
You didn't know what the conflict could be. Why the conflict?
I'm going to jump in here only because I do feel like we're getting a little off topic at this point, but I do appreciate the lively exchange. I think it is important for people that are looking at this particular forum, looking for information about strong mayor, we stick to that. But I understand, also the substance of what you guys are talking about, and not to take anything away from that. Why don't we go ahead and do this? If you guys want to continue on that track, you each have a closing statement opportunity here, 2 minutes each. We'll begin with the yes on Measure A side, and that's you, Chet.
Well, we believe all the issues that I laid out, an accountable mayor, a mayor who has a vision for the city, a mayor who has the authority to move that vision, an empowered city council who with 2/3 vote can override the mayor's budget authority, or the firing of a city manager, or the ordinance that's actually brought forward, creating a strong and well-organized legislative branch for the city. The provision of what people refer to as sweeteners, which we just simply think is a suite of policy changes that allow us to become a more inclusive city where equity and not just efficiency is a goal of city government. We think all this is accomplished without minimizing all of the things that make Sacramento the great city that it actually is, and that it is a city of neighborhoods. It will remain such. A city represented by councilmen who represent districts, who will give their voice and articulate the aspirations of the individuals who live in their communities, going forward. While the government system that we have is not bad, we know it could be much better. And we think that the ability for a city to do good and to do well by all of its citizens and all of its residents is achieved through this particular measure. It is imperfect as all things in lives are, but it is a far cry from what we currently have. A non-elected city manager who has controls over departments and budgets, who is not subjective to petitions, who's not subject to the Brown Act, who we have to corral in order to actively follow policies and the visions that have been articulated by leaders who are elected by city residents. We believe in Sacramento, we could do better than we are doing currently. And so for all those reasons, we ask you to support Measure A and to support putting Sacramento on a brighter pathway, a more efficient, effective, inclusive pathway into the future.
Craig, final thoughts, 2 minutes for a closing statement.
Thank you, Steve, very much. Thank you to the LPCA and the audience listening. Just want to go over the points that we've made. First, the strong mayor issue was exhaustively debated and settled by voters in 2014 when they rejected Measure L. 2, the frenzied rush to place Measure A on the ballot is really an affront to democracy. 3, number 4, I'm going to skip that one. City governance should not be overhauled without good cause, and good cause has not been demonstrated in this case. Next, real accountability means being held to account for performance, and a bad city manager can be fired at any time. A bad city manager, strong manager rather, cannot. Next, Measure A would diminish the power and influence of council members and neighborhoods. Measure A would likely reduce the effectiveness of city government, but likely have little impact on major city policies, according to our studies. Next, Measure A's sweeteners could be adopted by the city council by ordinance at any time without having to commit to strong mayor governance. Measure A's sweeteners are unvetted, they're vague, in some cases illiterate, and in some cases are even legally suspect, including invading the traditional power of the city council to control spending, as possibly constitutionally infirm. Next, Measure A's $40 million annual spending mandate would create endless financial problems for the city and force cuts in public safety spending. We no longer have the number of officers we had before the Great Recession. We've never fully recovered. We have the lowest ratio of cops to population of a city of our size, of any city of our size in the country. We've lost our traffic patrol. We've lost our community-oriented policing. This will lose more cops. Next is, and we haven't gotten into this, that Measure A's ambiguous reauthorization provision provides no real sunset provision. And finally,
on that point right there, Craig,
okay.
Out of time.
I got 11 out of the 12 in, so I'm happy.
Okay, all right, good. Well, first, before we get going, I just want to thank the Land Park Community Association for putting this whole event together. Want to thank Chet Hewitt with yes on Measure A. Want to thank Craig Powell with no on Measure A. And hopefully people watching got an opportunity to learn something tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.